Welcome to the Healthy Relationships Initiative podcast. Our goal is to provide information and tools to help you build happier, healthier, and safer relationships of all kinds. To learn more about HRI, please visit www.guilfordhri.org and check us out on social media at GuilfordHRI.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Healthy Relationships Initiative Relationship Booster. We're glad that you're here with us today for our program, which is on the topic of talking with kids about race and culture. My name is Christine Murray, and I am the director of the UNC Greensboro Center for Youth, Family, and Community Partnerships, and I'm also the director of the Healthy Relationships Initiative. The Healthy Relationships Initiative, our mission is to promote happy, healthy, and safe relationships of all kinds in Guilford County, and we invite you to check us out on our website at guilfordhri.org or visit us on social media at guilfordhri. So today's program is about talking with kids about race and culture, and we're thankful today to have two featured experts here with us, Stephanie Coard and Laura Gonzalez. So welcome to you both.
Thank you for the invitation.
And to get us started, it'd be great to hear a little bit about your background. So if we could first hear from Stephanie, and maybe you could share with us a little bit about your background in general, and then why this topic about talking with children about race and culture is so important to you.
Okay, sure. So I'm Dr. Stephanie Coard. I am a faculty member in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies, associate professor, and also director of their graduate studies program. And I've been here for quite a while, since 2006, and I'm a clinically trained psychologist. And the work that I do really focuses on thinking about the psychological implications of race, ethnicity, and culture as it relates to development and family functioning. And so I've always been interested in how families and individuals make sense of race and what that means to them in terms of their identity and in terms of their behavior and interactions with the world. But also, the clinician in me is interested in providing services and programs that families can use to help them navigate and negotiate, for example, the terrain of racism. So I do a lot of work on racial identity and racial socialization, and specifically thinking about how to incorporate those in evidence-based parenting practices and programs for them. And so yeah, it's just always been something that I have been interested in, I think professionally, but also personally. As an African-American woman and mother of three, this is something that I've grappled with and been challenged by from the time probably before I even had children, and as a child myself. So it's something that I'm passionate about, both personally and professionally.
Great. Yeah, thanks for sharing your passion both
Sure.
from both of those lenses. Do you mind if I ask how old your children are?
Well, they're not children anymore.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, 24, 22, and 18.
Oh, okay, great.
19.
Yeah,
he
it
just
changes
turned in
often.
December. He just turned 19, so yeah.
Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
So I'm sure over the years you've had a lot of really interesting conversations with your children too.
Absolutely. From early on. I mean, from pregnancy. I mean, I just remember having a sense of angst around, oh my gosh, like I'm about to have a child. Like, what is this going to mean for her, him, and for me as a parent?
Yeah.
And how can I make sure that they grow up to be healthy and happy?
Well, great. Well, thanks. Well, I can't wait to hear more from you, but also want to make sure we introduce Laura, too. So, Laura, what about you? Can you share a little bit about your background and interest in this topic?
Absolutely. I'm really glad Stephanie mentioned kind of the personal and the professional hats, because that's absolutely how I approach this topic as well. I'm Laura Gonzalez. I'm Associate Professor of Higher Education in the School of Ed here at UNCG. And my background also includes counselor education training. And so my research has sort of combined the developmental healthy lens from counselor ed and also sort of helping students to reach their potentials in terms of the educational arena. And I've been interested in doing that for students who come from Latinx immigrant families. So that's sort of how the culture lens has entered into my work interest. And I was really excited to have a chance to collaborate with both Dr. Coard and also I really want to mention our two other collaborators who are Dr. Gabby Levis-Stein, who's in psychology here at UNCG, and Dr. Lisa Kyang, who's in psychology at Wake Forest. So the four of us came together to sort of talk about, within different racial and ethnic groups or different cultural backgrounds and stances, how might these conversations between parents and kids look? So I was interested in that from the sort of promoting developmental well-being and health lens, but then also from the personal hat. My 3 children are a little bit younger than Stephanie's. They are 13, 11, and 11. And so we definitely have vested interests in thinking about, how do we approach these conversations with our kids? And I will just say that in case anyone is watching the video, I am white. You're not mistaken. And I'm married to a Latino. So our family has sort of a blended cultural background in terms of my background is Scot-Irish and German. My husband's is Panamanian. And so our children are Panamanian Americans. Our family is bilingual and bicultural. And so that's been interesting for us, just to think about how do we talk to our kids about their variety of cultures, not knowing exactly how people in the community will perceive them, but wanting them to have a strong foundation in both of their sets of heritages. So that's how I came to this work.
Great. Well, thanks so much for sharing both of your kind of backgrounds and how you came to this work. And we always, when we do these boosters, we always kind of encourage people to share as they feel around their personal and professional experiences, because obviously when we're talking about relationships and families, we can talk about that from the works lens, but of course we learn a lot from our personal experiences too. So I appreciate you sharing those perspectives.
Absolutely.
So in today's world, why is it so important, just in general for people, and then we'll move into talking about children, but to have conversations about race and culture?
Well, it's important because we live in a racially conscious society. I mean, let's just be real about it. I mean, we live in a racially conscious society. We live in a society that's incredibly diverse, which is wonderful. But we haven't always, as a society, known what to do with that. And it oftentimes have done things that have actually placed certain groups and certain populations in positions that have not been in their best interest. So we live in a society that's racially conscious. We live in a society where racism exists. And there are populations and individuals, families, communities that are minoritized, and so that's not a good thing. Okay, so how do we, embrace America and all the good things that come with it? But that also means embracing some of the things that we're not so good at. And for families of color in particular, navigating and negotiating the terrain of racism is a reality. So discrimination, racism, prejudice are things that we live with in our daily lives. And so how can we live in a society that is racially conscious and divides us and places some above others and not address it? And so if we don't address it, we know that it doesn't lend itself to being well-adjusted or happy, healthy, and so we really need to do a better job and be more conscious about doing just that.
And so with it being so important to have these conversations, why is it so difficult to have these conversations if there's so much awareness of race and culture, but it's a difficult thing for people, even adults, to talk about?
Because we don't want to talk about things that are difficult, and we don't want to talk about things that aren't good topics, I mean, so anytime we are having a feeling of angst or sadness or stress or anything that doesn't feel good, it's hard to talk about, and it's hard to think about how can I talk about this in a way that's realistic but doesn't either make my child upset or make my child think that somehow their opportunities are limited. I mean, it's similar to having discussions about chronic illnesses or sexuality. I mean, they're just these hot topics that are just difficult to talk about, but are so incredibly important. And so I think it's no different than that. But the issue is that by not talking about it, we are also talking about it, right? And so we have to think about, what does me not talking about it mean for my children and for my parenting? And the fact is that they're living in a world where life is happening and these experiences are occurring. And so do you allow the child to make meaning of that, or yourself to kind of just go with the flow with no skills and no sort of repertoire or tools? or do you try to deal with it head on? And it's just important to be proactive about it.
I'll just add too, from the perspective of a white person, that I feel like we have had the privilege and the luxury to skate by without thinking about culture as a deeply embedded part of our identities, which it is. So whereas communities like Stephanie was just referencing, for whom their culture or identity has been sort of visible and noted by others and has caused them to receive differential treatment, I know growing up, nobody really had a conversation with me about my ethnic identity, my cultural background, or what that could mean to me. So I really, at the point when I started to raise those questions for myself, I was a much older person, and I felt like I was catching up on a conversation that other people had been having for a long time. And so I felt also like I was behind in terms of my own human development, in just not acknowledging that culture is important too, even if your skin is white. So,
which I would imagine to some extent, from a parent's perspective, if you have not had conversations with others, whether it was growing up or even just, whether it's through your professional training or with friends, and then maybe also had that, like you said, the catching up, you don't have that period of kind of self-reflection or talking about it, or if you grew up in a family where people weren't talking about it and what that communicated, like this is not something we talk about, then as a parent especially, you really may feel uncomfortable and unprepared and unequipped to have these conversations.
Right. And because you're not directly experiencing these insults, whether they're big or small, you feel like you're not in a position where you need to. It's almost like, well, this isn't occurring for us, so why do we need to discuss this? But as you interact more and more, and and again, the fact that we are a diverse society, racism is something that shouldn't fall in one person or one community's lap. I mean, it really is something that we all need to take part in terms of understanding and owning our role, either passively or not so passively in that process. And so yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult for different reasons for different people, but I think we're at a stage now where we really need to all come to the table and have these discussions.
And so let's shift it a little bit more to thinking more specifically about talking with kids. And I guess I should say we kind of are thinking probably mostly about parents, but this could also be other children in the life. People are involved in young people, whether it's also as a mentor, maybe as a coach, as a teacher, a Sunday school teacher, a member of a faith community. So there's a lot of ways that these conversations might not come up. Of course, we probably hope and think that a lot of this will be, these conversations will be had by parents, but I think we should also think about kind of parents or adults in general. So talking with children about these topics can be difficult, right? And it can be very challenging. But also, I think in some ways, especially with younger kids, they don't have much of a filter, so they might be the ones who are introducing the conversation. So what does it look like different in terms of how these conversations might start?
Well, let me first say that I think you're right in that there are lots of different socializing agents, right? You have schools, you have people in the community, people at home, and even within your own family, right? So you have different folks who are having these conversations and influencing those conversations, right? And so if you think about these talks, I mean, I think it's really based in what we call something called racial socialization, right? And it's racial ethnic socialization, which is the idea that it's important to give children and give others an understanding of who they are and what that means for them, right? But it's not just enough to talk to them about who they are and how wonderful they are, right? It's also about the realities that there is racism and discrimination. So it's also about incorporating problem-solving skills and techniques that will help children to problem solve and navigate sometimes very hostile or uncomfortable situations, right? So it's about information and feeling good, and it's also about, well, how do you navigate, right? And so these conversations are important to have with children, because children need to understand how to navigate the world and the interactions that they are in. And I know for myself personally, I never wanted my child to be in a situation where they didn't have some repertoire of tools or something they could reflect on, like, okay, this is what mom was talking about. Okay, now I can do this, I could do that, or I could do this, and kind of think about what their options are as opposed to just being reactive or internalizing. But it's really important for parents to step up and do this. And I know that with One Talk at a Time, which is the program that we've developed, we start out with talking to them about how to just set yourself up for those discussions. And we came up with a process called Ready, Set, Talk. And when we talk about being ready, basically being ready is about parents or whoever that person is, just being mindful and conscious of where they are in this conversation. Like, okay, I'm about to have this conversation. How am I feeling? Is this, something that I'm prepared to do? What do I want to get out of this conversation? And being very intentional about it. And so we talk to them about breathing and about, if you need to say a prayer, if you need to listen to music. But anytime you're having a difficult, something that's difficult that's about to occur, it's about just being mindful, right? And so we talk to them about being ready, and then set means basically, okay, so you're intentional, you got to a point where this is something you're going to do and you have goals for doing it. Now it's about setting the stage for how you're going to have those conversations.
And what are some of those ways to set that stage?
So setting the stage could mean thinking about, okay, is this something that it has to do with something they're experiencing in the community? I guess it's giving it context, right? I mean, giving it context and giving it legs. Like, what is my child's personality? Okay, my child is very sensitive, so this means I need to maybe do it this way. Is this something that is coming from somebody at the school? Is it an authority figure? It's really thinking about all the different characteristics and all the context, so that you can make sure that the message you want to give is going to be delivered in a way that addresses that context, right? And then talk is doing it, actually. I mean, it's like, okay, it's like taking that jump, taking the leap to actually have the conversation. And one of the things we talk about is the fact that this is not one conversation that's so articulate and, lengthy. It's really having multiple conversations. And parents won't always do it right. I don't know that there is one right way, quite honestly, but it's having multiple talks and being open to just being able to engage in that dialogue.
And we did put the link to this program in the chat room for those who are here in the live program, but
Great.
Can you give the website address for people who may be listening later to the podcast?
Certainly. So this is, right now it is located in the web space of the Caminos lab, which is Dr. Stein's psychology lab. So Caminos is CAMINOS and LAB, Caminos Lab, all one word, .org/1talk.
Perfect.
And One Talk at a Time is the name of the program, as Stephanie mentioned. And when people open that website, they will see 4 different entry points. So one, because of the backgrounds and interests of the researcher team, we wanted to be able to address the needs and interests of African American parents, Asian American parents, Latinx parents who are English speaking, and Latinx parents who are Spanish speaking. So there's 4 different ways that people can sort of start into the materials. It's free. It takes maybe an hour or 2 if you did the whole thing all the way through, but it's something that you can start and stop as you have time. And it's just a resource that we really hope community members will pick up and utilize because of our deep interest in helping equip people to have these conversations.
And we showcase or highlight parents having these conversations of these various backgrounds. So it's nice to be able to see other people, right, model what it is that, that I maybe can think about doing. Right?
And why was it really important to you to have culture or racial specific programs and not just one overarching program?
So we did some focus groups actually because we were curious about how might this look different or similar across the racial ethnic groups that we were interested in. And we did learn about some important differences. And again, like since I am a white person, I'm not trying to speak for any of these populations. I don't represent them. But just from a researcher perspective, having heard Latinx immigrant parents and Chinese American parents talking in those focus groups about what is challenging for them or what has worked for them in having those conversations, it was really different from hearing the African American parents talk. So I think immigrant parents in particular have often grown up in a context where they are the majority, and so coming to the U.S. is such a shift for them in terms of maybe for the first time they are put in this minoritized position, or they maybe never had anyone have a conversation with them about racism in their home country, but now it becomes much more relevant to their kids here, but it's not their child's experience and their own experience are so different along those that I think for the immigrant parents we found just uncertainty about how do I even broach this topic, whereas the African American parents were not uncertain about the need to broach.
Yeah, my research focuses on African American families, and I can tell you with one talk at a time, and even work that I've done prior to that, African American parents we don't have the luxury of not talking about it. Now, we're not always the most developmentally appropriate or savvy in how we do it. But that's okay, because we do it because there is a need to do it. And unfortunately, the reason that we don't have the luxury of doing it is because of the visibleness of who we are, right? But also in terms of the incidences and societal issues that are occurring in terms of the media. I mean, it's happening every day. So we have to talk about it. And so one of the things that I noticed with the African American families, that they're definitely having these conversations. They're having these conversations very early. They're having conversations that one might think are not developmentally appropriate, and a little too sophisticated, let's just say. But let's think about it. I mean, some of the issues that are going on in the world and here are not developmentally appropriate. Mm-hmm. I mean, so if you have a 10-year-old African American male who's being treated like he's 21, that's an issue that has to be addressed. There's nothing developmental about interactions with certain law enforcement or in certain spaces and places where our children are not respected. And so it's important for African Americans to get that message out. And so one of the things that I know for me and my work has been important is helping parents to kind of think about being more intentional and mindful before having these conversations, because they're so busy trying to react and help to buffer and stop it, that there's not always that forethought. So, yeah. Yeah,
and that's a really interesting kind of practical way of thinking about things, too, that for parents having these conversations, we can kind of have ideas maybe about, this is a developmentally appropriate point to talk about, but actually these conversations almost need to correspond more to kind of the realities of the child's or the family's experiences, because somebody might think, well, that's not an appropriate, you don't want to talk about, say, violence or, other types of possibly maybe distressing issues to a younger child. But if this is something that a child is seeing even at a very young age, you may need to shift and say, well, this isn't just about what I would say to, thinking that would be something that I would want to talk about with a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old, but it's something that maybe we have to talk about sooner than we're ready.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk about that a little bit more, too, about that developmental process, though, because I do think there are some important kind of considerations there. And I know you mentioned when you were giving your introduction that really these were conversations or thoughts that you were having even while you were pregnant.
Oh, absolutely.
And of course you're not necessarily having conversations, or at least not where the baby's talking back to you when before a baby can talk.
But having conversations
how soon do they start?
About trying to, prepare them. I mean, I remember being excited. Oh, wow. But the second thought was, oh my gosh, what does this mean for my child? And I'm thinking so far ahead. And so I never really did not think about it, quite honestly. So yeah, I mean, I thought very early on, and even in utero, I was giving messages about, the world out here is not so great, but that's okay. I'm going to protect you and make you happy, and, telling, my baby to be how they were going to be such a beautiful baby and a smart baby. And, you're right. Like I'm giving them all these messages, and I don't know if she or he heard me, but it was important for me to start inoculating them with those messages. So yeah, early on. And then as soon as they were born, then it just, moved to, okay, so how do I think about this in terms of the types of contexts and situations and schools I put my child in? I did not want my children to ever be called the N-word and not have some sort of response that I felt was not going to put them at a disadvantage, if that makes sense. All of my kids were called the N-word by the time they were 7.
And so how did you talk about that? Or how would you suggest other people talk about that?
Yeah.
Both before something like that happens, is there any way to prepare? Or is it more when it happens, and then what do you say?
Well, I think similar to One Talk at a Time, we really focus on 2 messages, really. One is sort of those cultural affirming messages, and then the other are sort of these prep for bias types of messages. So early on, it's really important to have those, those cultural affirmation types of messages. Having children understand who they are, where they come from, and that it's such a beautiful, positive thing. Everything from what they look like to the types of foods they eat, and giving children a sense of who they are, right? Without even thinking about all the messiness that surrounds them, right? But just inoculating them with, you are a positive child, this is why. And so that's really important, and we know early on. But we know that that's not enough because there's reality too. But that's really important to do that and lay that foundation, because then you can then start imparting other messages about what happens when people do not affirm those same types of characteristics, right? And so for me, it was important for my children to know that they were smart and that they came from a family of love, and that, their skills and what they look like and all those things were coming from me and their father and from God and whoever, I was really just trying to make sure that they understood that they didn't just plop here, right? They had a purpose, and it was a good purpose. And so, but then it was like, okay, now you're going to be going into certain spaces and places where some people just won't be nice, right? And so I would do role plays with them. Even young children early on, I often would use with my kids and with other young kids, like even candies and things like that, like Starburst, for example. Kids get an idea of how one can feel different by thinking about, okay, so do you like the yellow ones or the orange ones? Well, I don't like the yellow ones, so let's put the yellow ones over here. And so how do you think the yellows, feel when they're over here, or the pinks, and so using things like M&Ms or candies and things where they can begin to think about what tastes good and what feels good, and then what happens when people or things, candies, are sort of shunned. And so they're just things you could do in role playing early on, using books, of course, and using the media to have those conversations. And of course, as children get older and cognitively they're able to understand more abstract types of things, then the conversations can get more sophisticated. One of the things that some of my parents that I've worked with have said is, I don't let my child watch the news. But the reality is you can't stop that, because they get the news, they get it on their phones, they see things, right? And so I would rather have part in them making meaning of that as opposed to letting them make meaning of their own. So I oftentimes encourage parents to use the media, use things that are in the news to start to broach these conversations, but not to get ahead of them. So it's really important to ask, so what do you think about what you just saw? What does that mean for you? Because oftentimes we're thinking at a level that has much more baggage, let's just say, than the child.
Right. So like Stephanie was just alluding to, that sometimes there are conversations where something has happened, like a child has been called a name or a child has observed something that is upsetting to them, and they will come and seek guidance. Or sometimes there are more proactive conversations where we are wanting to prepare them ahead of time. But I think it's so important. I think any parent who's been around young kids knows how observant they are, and how, I think you said at the beginning, like they see things and they can be very blunt because they don't necessarily have all the filters yet to just notice or comment on differences. And I think especially, coming from my perspective as a white parent, it's important not to be afraid to say to children, yes, there are differences, because I think when we start to be like, oh, well, don't say that, don't talk about that, it makes children feel like, well, there's something wrong with being different, when I think the message we want to give is, like, Stephanie's children will look like her because she's their mom, and my kids will look somewhat like me and somewhat like their dad, because that's where we came from, and those are all wonderful, beautiful ways to be. But if I said to my kids, oh, don't talk about the way that Stephanie's children look different, that doesn't allow for them to gain appreciation for difference. It kind of starts them off thinking, well, something's not okay about that if somebody's different. So I think being willing to follow the kids with what they're noticing and just help, just kind of using open-ended questions and reflections to kind of help them figure out what it is that they're noticing in their world in a way that they can incorporate it and be healthy.
And I think, too, I would add and would be curious kind of to get your thoughts, and I'm going to be a little selfish about something that I do and get your thoughts on it, but to create kind of safe spaces for having those conversations and asking, kind of giving your child some guidelines on, when is it okay to talk about some of those differences. So, for example, this is where I'm going to share a personal example, and if you want to tell me that I'm totally wrong and I shouldn't be doing this, you're welcome to do that, but I always tell them if they have comments about any sort of difference, that to not say it in front of another person, but that as soon as we're by ourselves, we can talk about it. And so it is very often that we'll like get in the car and they're like, da da da, whatever the question is. And it's a lot of times it's, not necessarily racial or ethnic differences. It's other types of difference, age, appearance, other sorts of things. But that's one way that I've kind of handled that, because my kids have embarrassed me a time or two by certain things they've said. Later I'll tell you a story that I don't want to put in recording, but where you just want to crawl, you're like, why is there not a sinkhole forming under my feet right now to bury me at the grounds? But that sometimes it can be embarrassing, but to create those spaces so they do know that, like, if they do have questions or if they're like confused by something that they saw, that they'd have an opportunity to talk about it. And no question is a bad question. It's just sometimes we need to think about, the right place. So tell me if I'm wrong or semi-wrong.
I think that's what many, many, many parents do. I guess my only question is then, because you do this because it's uncomfortable for you, and so I'm thinking, is there a way for you to not be so uncomfortable? And I think the only way to not be uncomfortable is to be open to at least them being able to share this information, but maybe putting some parameters on, but we can discuss it later. But I guess I'm just a little concerned about the shutdown factor. I was in the store the other day, and I actually had to think, should I intervene? Should I not? Should I say something? But similarly, not that this is your case, but what happened is a child, I think they maybe about 6 or 7, said to their mother, there was clearly an adopted parent situation where there was 2 white parents and a black baby. And the child said to this white mother, and said, that doesn't match. Why is that baby brown? And the mother looked like she wanted to like crawl under the other mother. The other mother. And she just got red in the face and was just like, oh my gosh, And I just sat there and I watched, and the child's waiting for an answer. The child's just like, they don't match. Like, what, why don't they match? They don't match like we match, Yeah. And the mother was just like, don't, And I kind of looked at the other parents, and because I know that they were ear shy and they could hear as well, and they just kind of smiled and moved on. But the child wanted an answer. They wanted something, and the mother was not giving anything. And so finally I did say to the mother, I said, your child, I said, I know you probably feel uncomfortable. I said, but children are so aware of difference. And I said, all she wants to know is that there are other ways in which families come together.
Right.
And so maybe you could just talk to her about the different ways. I don't know why I'm whispering this now, but maybe, because I was kind of whispering in the store.
Probably.
But I was like, that would have been the perfect idea to say, you know what? You're right. They don't match. Then there are different ways that families come together. And we can talk about this more, when we get home. And then I would maybe go out and buy a book or something to help me then have those discussions. But I guess, children are being very honest about the fact that they, that they just have questions and they're curious. And so I do, feel like, wow, wouldn't have been a great teaching moment.
Yeah, and I think that is part of the importance of having those more proactive. So I always was really conscious of all different kinds of representation in the books that we would read and different things like that. So I think part of that is kind of goes back to both, as you're saying, like thinking about it proactively and then, the sort of reactively. Because the reality is when you're out at the store, you don't know if you're going to offend somebody when your child says something. You might or you might not, but I think children ask those questions, especially in these younger ages, really, and even as they get older, oftentimes just much more, out of sort of confusion, and they're like trying to figure out, what does this mean? my 12-year-old son and I were having some conversations in the car more about kind of gender identity and sexual orientation last night, and he was just like, I just don't understand. I said, okay, well, let's talk this through, but it's kind of important to have those conversations in advance too, and then be prepared for, I like what you said too. I should have said, I don't try not to shut those conversations down, don't talk about this until we're in the car, but more so to kind of, give somewhat of an answer. I like how you said with this family, it's sort of, well, there's lots of different ways that families can look or can come together. And the reality is when you're out at the store, you really don't know how that family came together. It could be adoption, foster child, a lot of possible reasons too. So, that's another piece too.
But I like what you said about the importance of the proactive piece, because that will help to put some parameters around it. So for example, if you are having, conversations with your child about differences around different things, then when those differences come up, you all have been able to at least talk about how that child might bring it up. So for example, if a child, we know a young child may refer to somebody who is very overweight and use a term that we may think is not a good term to use, but a child isn't really thinking that. They're just using words that they hear. So being proactive would mean, these are some of the words that we use and we won't use, and this is some of the things that they mean, and so that there's some sort of verbiage around and language, so you all have kind of an understanding, so it's not one of those sort of blatant things where the child feels like, they got to spit something out and you all haven't had that conversation. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Just having that proactive, some sort of parameters about what is it going to be like when we go out in the community. What are some of the things that we can do and can't do, And
I think that also goes back to what we were saying earlier about one talk at a time, that even if there's a conversation that afterwards you think, I wish I had done that a little bit differently with my kids, tomorrow's another day and you can try again. And I feel like even just that, modeling that, I said this to you the other day, and as I thought about it, I thought about the ways that it could have, hurt somebody else's feelings if they heard me say that. And, thinking back, I might have tried something else, or just showing your children that it's okay to also, have a redo, to try again, to learn and reflect and do better. And so I think sometimes the thing that stops parents from having these conversations is that pressure to oh my gosh, what if I did it wrong? Or what if I hurt someone's feelings? What if I set a bad example? So I think it's really important to us to kind of just help parents take that pressure off, because there's so many other pressures. And to just say, I'm just going to every little day, like, try to have a piece of this conversation, knowing that not each piece has to be perfect, but that altogether it starts to model a way that kids can approach difference of many kinds.
And I think that's a really great approach to it. I think often, like, when we think about parents talking to their kids about sex, it's like, oh, have you had the talk yet?
Right.
Like, it's a one-time thing. And it's the same thing, like, well, have you had the talk about race or ethnicity? Like, no, that is an ongoing conversation. And actually, the worst thing I think that parents can do, whether it's by shutting down the conversations or by not talking about it at all or seeming so uncomfortable, is shutting the door. You know, you can always kind of recover if you do something that you wish you do, you know, say something, or, you know, you can always recover from that. But if you shut the door and your child doesn't feel that you're a safe space to talk about it, then that door may never get back open, and you may not be able to have some of these important conversations.
You're right. And I think it's also important to make sure you keep your finger on the pulse in terms of your child's understanding of these things, because you don't want to overreact. You mentioned the sex talk, and, you know, a child says, oh, we're dating. And I can, what do you mean you're dating? Well, you can't be dating. Well, you know, but if you just simply said, well, what does that mean to you? Oh, it means we text in the morning. Oh, okay. And so that will then inform how you then approach it, right? I mean, so it's important to talk and have these open, proactive discussions, right? Because it helps you sort of keep your finger on the pulse in terms of their understanding and their meaning of these things. And that's something that we have to constantly do.
And what about, so kind of noticing differences, I think, is one piece of this. And we've touched on it a little bit, but I think it's important to spend some time on what happens as children really do start to realize racism, other forms of oppression that are, you know, as they start to notice kind of not just, I'm different from you, but also whether it's directed toward them, someone who looks like them or comes from the same background as them, or if they're noticing it for others. And also, I guess, kind of related to that, maybe to speak about how that might look different for different cultural groups based on your work.
So I think I might have lost track of the first part of the question as it moved on, but so for example, I was thinking about one of my kids who was having a conversation with one of his friends. His friend is African American. My child is Latino and white mixed. So they were talking about what happened with Colin Kaepernick. And so it was sort of prompted by, you know, conversations that are happening in the media, things that were relevant to them. And so they were trying to say, like, was it, like, kind of which aspect of this was problematic? So they were, like, saying, well, is it wrong that the president told the players they can't kneel? Or what was he kneeling about in the first place? And so I really just tried to listen to kind of where he was with that conversation as he was relaying it to me, and to help him think about kind of what he knows about it, and maybe what extra thing I can add to the picture to help him understand, like, the history that sort of undergirds that choice that Colin Kaepernick made, or how that conversation for my child might be different from the conversation his friend is having at home with his parents. So just sort of, like, listening first to gauge where they are, and then I just try to, like, think about what's one more piece of information I can give them to help him have a broader context, or to see other people's point of view in addition to his own.
And then depending on your child and how they sort of go as sort of the result of that process, I think it's also important to then give them perspective of others, because, you know, ultimately you want your child to be an advocate for social justice and fairness, right? And so it's not just enough to understand and, okay, I behave in this way, but also making sure that they feel comfortable with holding other people accountable and making sure that they understand that even if it doesn't affect me directly, I maybe can have a role in making sure it doesn't affect somebody else. And so being an ally. And I think that all of us in one way or form, and maybe some of us multiple forms, have some level of privilege, right? Whether it's economic or skin color or residential, whatever that privilege is. And I think that we should, you know, be mindful of what our privilege is and using that privilege to help others.
So what does that look like kind of on a really tangible, practical level for a child? What can a parent or another adult do to help the children in their lives kind of become these advocates for justice in a way, that's kind of developmentally appropriate maybe at different stages.
Yeah. Part of when people go through our website and the curriculum, they will find at some point in there lists of books, movies, websites, kind of resources for kind of helping to set the stage for these conversations. So for example, my daughter right now is reading a book about the historical point in time when India was partitioned into Pakistan and India, and that people based on religion were sort of moved into different spaces. And it talks about one girl's family who had like one Muslim parent and one Hindi parent. And so even though my child has never been to India, she said, oh, I know what that's like to have one parent from different groups. And then she empathized with the experience of the girl in this book whose family was kind of being pulled apart, and hearing bad things about each of these groups that she felt like she belonged to both of them. And so like we try to just really read broadly. I feel lucky that my kids are growing up in a generation where they do have a lot more kind of cross-cultural interactions, much more than I had when I was growing up. And so in that way, I don't feel like they are catching up in the same way that I know I had to in my growth and development. But I also feel like it's my job to help them navigate that new environment in a way that does attend to inclusion and social justice.
Yeah, absolutely. We, in doing this one talk at a time, actually, the documentary company that was doing it was a woman-owned document company. They were white, and they talked about, oh wow, we want to be able to do this too. Like, how do we think about this for ourselves? And that's when we talked about, what does it mean to be white allies, and what does it mean to what is one talk at a time or racial socialization mean for white families? And so it does mean about being able to learn about other groups, like you were saying, learning about other groups, and also being able, and that exposure to other groups. But it also means, acknowledging the privileges that you have, right? I mean, and the reality is this is something that they don't think about, they're not conscious of, but just by virtue of maybe what they look like, they have certain privileges. And so if they see someone who is being bullied or being made to feel bad because of how they look or the food they're eating at lunchtime or whatever, you do have a voice, and you can speak up and use that privilege, because no one's going to say that to you, but you can advocate for this child, right? And so it's just making them aware of the fact that even though it doesn't affect them directly, they can have an impact.
And I don't think you have a program currently for white families, right?
No,
is that something
we've been asked?
We've been asked. We're very interested in thinking about that, and I think just sort of the socio-political climate right now indicates that white people, from my point of view, should not just be on the sidelines, as Stephanie said earlier too, that if I want to be a member of my community, that means not just a member of a white community, that means member of Greensboro as a multicultural community. And so thinking that I can sit on the sideline is not accurate. So that means that I have to think about my own racial privilege and be able to help my kids think about how people will perceive them as lighter-skinned folks. And so I really do think that white families need to grapple with, how do we talk to ourselves about culture? How do we take off our misperceptions that we don't have a stake in the conversation about culture and ethnicity? How can we push back on misinformation that we receive about other groups that prevents us from having whole pictures of kind of all the parts of who folks are in other groups? So I do think white people can do better at addressing the healthy parts of who we are culturally, and also the ways that our power culturally has made other people's lives exceedingly difficult. And I feel like there's so many examples of that right now in our society that it's like to not have that conversation almost feels impossible to me. But
so kind of, and I think that I think it's also probably there are probably also some geographic influences too that are really important to bring into some of these conversations, because I know you to know that you grew up in Pittsburgh just like me, so we grew up in the north. I don't know, where are you from originally?
DC area.
DC, okay, so and it's here we are in North Carolina, which is in the South, that can be a very racial issues, I think, are very different in some ways. I mean, there's some similarities, but there's also some real differences, at least from my perspective, moving here from up north compared to being in a southern region. So, I think people do need to kind of consider those aspects of it in these conversations too. And I guess just kind of shifting, because we're down to our last 10 minutes, so I want to make sure we really, for anybody who's listening, do walk away with some practical strategies. And it sounds like, a lot of that is being open to having the conversations. We've talked about books, different kind of resources that families can
talk.
In
terms of just being mindful and intentional.
Yep. I know one thing that I've always really tried to do in my parenting is intentionally go into diverse spaces in terms of choices for which schools my kids have attended, which where we do our sports for my kids, what church we go to, so and that to me has been something in my conversations with my own kids, really helpful. That one, I want them to see that that's important to me, that we are, kind of making that's just a core value for our family. And then it also opens up a lot of conversations too. So I think in some ways it's, one practical strategy might be like really kind of putting yourself into context where these questions come up, and then being open to having them. So what are some other kind of thoughts that you might share?
Well, I was just thinking that I don't want parents to think that all of this socialization occurs with this dialogue, because like you were saying, just by virtue of the settings you put them in, that's telling them something, that's modeling something. And so sometimes these conversations are not verbal conversations.
And it's even too kind of just really to follow up with that. I think it's also modeling, not just where you go, but also, do we eat different types of food as a family? What do my friends look like? Am I friends with only people that look just like me, or am I intentionally, creating friendships with people who have very different backgrounds? And what movies do we watch? What music do we listen to? When I'm listening to podcasts, who am I listening to? And it's not even something that you have to necessarily say, well, I'm listening to this for the purpose of, giving you exposure to diversity.
And it's not that you have to be the expert on everything. By exposing your child to different experiences and events, that takes the burden off of you in terms of having to be completely knowledgeable about every single thing and everybody's history. You can learn together, and honestly, even within groups, many of the African American families I talk to talk about the fact that they don't really feel like they know their history at the level that they should. And they know about parts of it, but I talk to them about, using that as a way to engage your child, and y'all learn together. So you don't have to know everything about everybody, but just, accessing resources can be very, very beneficial, and it can serve the purpose and not make you feel so uncomfortable because you feel like you've got to be the expert.
I was just looking at one of the tip sheets that's built into our intervention, and some of the tips that we give for parents include sort of remembering to manage your own emotions around the topic. So whether that is like frustration and anger out of like generations of abuse and discrimination, or fearfulness about getting something wrong, or the unknown, or like nobody ever modeled this for me, so how can I do this? So just remembering to kind of, as part of preparing to do this, to manage your own emotions, and then to find a support system. So like being in this research team with Stephanie, Gabby, and Lisa has been an awesome opportunity for me to learn and grow. And it's helped me think about, like ways that I can do better, like modeling after conversations that I have with them, learning from others. Don't feel overwhelmed. Just remember to kind of do one talk at a time and take a small step. So I think we do sometimes build up barriers in our own way when we think we have to do it all and do it perfectly and do it by ourselves, when in fact we can do one piece at a time. We can do it in community and with support. But just starting, I think, is like the thing we really want to encourage parents to do, because as Stephanie said before, and is so important to repeat, that if we're not having these conversations, that absence of conversation speaks a lot to kids, and they will notice it.
So to wrap things up, what are your kind of final thoughts? Let's hear from each of you.
Wow, a lot. Do it.
Do it. Mm-hmm.
Just be open to the realities that we don't live in a bubble, and that we have diversity around us, and that diversity should be engaged with and embraced as opposed to shied away from. And using our privilege, whatever that may be, at whatever amount that may be, to think about how to advocate for others as well as advocating for ourselves, but to advocate for others, and to have these conversations with your child. Also, keep in mind, again, not one talk. These are just multiple conversations. And just like with anything that we struggle with parenting, it's something that will just get better over time. It shouldn't prevent us from doing it. Mm-hmm. And it's so important. And we know from research how important it is, particularly for African American children.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think I keep coming back to the idea of like teachable moments, and sometimes you just find those in a day, like the Colin Kaepernick conversation my child was having, or, like something you see on the news, or something you see in a store together with your child. So being able to take advantage of those teachable moments, but also thinking about ways to craft and create and structure those teachable moments. Mm-hmm. So like all the great resources that we have in this community, to go ahead and just find time to go there as a family, and then have enough leisure to, to check in with your kids about like, well, what did you see? What did you notice? What did you like about that? Mm-hmm. So I think just remaining open to those teachable moments, that it doesn't have to be like, I'm clearing my calendar on Saturday and all day we're going to have courageous conversations.
It's going to be so articulate.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's the thing that my child is going to remember when they're 40, and they're going to be like, wow, I can't believe I'm so lucky my parents, had this amazing conversation and imparted so much wisdom.
Right.
But I guess I just think, too, to tie it all together is just that, these are really difficult issues to talk about, but obviously we're coming from the Healthy Relationships Initiative perspective, and, in many ways relationships can grow healthier and stronger through addressing difficult topics. Absolutely. Whether, of all kinds. And so I definitely think people who've listened to our program today gained a lot of good insights for having those conversations. And do check out the One Talk at a Time resources. And for those, again, who are with the live program, we've shared the link. And then for those who may be listening later, be sure to check that out and keep an eye on this line of research, because I'm sure you all are going to be coming out with a lot of other great resources and tools as well. So. But thanks to everybody for joining us for today's program. We really appreciate it. If you are here for the live program, please go ahead and fill out the feedback form. And our next live relationship booster will be on Friday, February 7th. And speaking of differences between people, the topic for that one is going to be on parenting a child with special needs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so Thank you so much, Laura and Stephanie, for being here today and for joining us for this program.
Appreciate it.
Our pleasure.
All right, thank you.